In the heart of southern England, there is an ancient forest, where the past and the present exist side by side. Once a wild place, generations of hunters, farmers, and foresters have each left their mark on the landscape. Echoes of those distant times still haunt the forest. Today, people come to this ancient forest to seek refuge from the modern world. Only 80 miles from London, it absorbs 8 million visitors a year. We know it by the name it was given nearly 1,000 years ago, the New Forest. Before then, it was known as Ytene, the wild wasteland. The unique nature of this forest has been shaped by its long history of exploitation. Farmers living within the forest have always needed somewhere to graze livestock. Their domestic horses and cattle have roamed here for centuries. The trees themselves were valuable. Timber was crucial for both fuel and building, and before they were cut, trees provided food and shelter both for livestock and the creatures of the forest. But for a long time, this was a royal deer forest. The term forest does not simply refer to woodland. There are areas within the New Forest where trees may never have grown. It was a place subject to forest law, regulations promoting the welfare of the deer at the expense of the local people. So much so that often there was little choice but to break this law. Our story of the forest starts 10,000 years ago, when much of Britain lay under a sheet of ice. The glaciers didn't reach the New Forest, but here it was bleak and bitterly cold. As the climate warmed, the ice melted, and life returned to the rivers and streams. Lampreys gathered in the spring to spawn, as they still do today. These primitive fish have no jaws, just a sucker around the mouth, useful for moving stones to clear a gravel nest. The males use their suckers to grip their mates, ready to fertilize the eggs as they are released. As the ice retreated, bogs and heaths emerged. On the very poorest soils, trees would never grow. These are some of Britain's oldest landscapes, descended from the thawing tundra of the Ice Age. Today they still attract creatures from the far north. This is the handiwork of a butcher bird from Scandinavia. The great grey shrike, a winter visitor, catches small birds and reptiles and impales them on thorns. The butcher bird keeps a well-stocked larder. A thorn serves as a skewer, as the shrike doesn't have the gripping talons of most predatory birds. As the land grew warmer, the first trees took root, pines and birches. Red deer lived in these open forests. So too did wild horses, or tarpans. They survived the Ice Age in Britain, but died out as the land continued to change. Today, ponies take their place. After the pines and birches came the broad-leafed trees. When the Egyptians were building their first pyramids, most of Britain lay under a blanket of forest. Lime and ash, beech and oak, the trees of the wildwood. But the primeval forest didn't last for long. 6,000 years ago, farmers replaced the forest hunters of Britain. And by the time the Celts brought the Iron Age to these islands, half the wildwood of southern England had fallen to the plough. The new forest survived. The acid soil on which the trees flourished grew poor crops. The dark wildwoods and treacherous bogs remained, places where the superstitious feared to venture. To the Celtic people, the forest was a sacred place. As if by magic, trees shed their leaves in winter and regrew them in spring, symbols of the great cycle of death and rebirth. With their roots in the underworld and their branches in the sky, trees forged a link between the spiritual and physical worlds. One creature of the wildwood also embodied these mystical qualities. Deer shed their antlers and grew new ones each year, and so mirrored the symbolism of the trees. They came to represent the vitality of the forest. Adorned by antlers, the Celtic god Cernunnos was the guardian of the land's fertility. Later, he would be cast as the evil horned devil. But a domestic animal held the highest place of honor in the Celtic spirit world, the horse. Epona, the horse goddess, was worshipped by the Celts throughout Europe. Today's New Forest ponies are almost as highly regarded. Though their origins are unknown, they are domestic horses, introduced long after the wild forest horse became extinct. But they may well have been here when the Roman legions landed 2,000 years ago. The Celtic people the Romans found here lived by farming. Although the forest provided a place to hunt, it was just as important for grazing their cattle and horses. In time, this would change the nature of the forest. Centuries of hungry mouths stripped the forest floor of woodland plants and most of the shrubs. These open pasture woodlands are very different places from the claustrophobic tangle of the wildwood. By contrast, high overhead in the canopy, little has changed. It's still possible to glimpse the wildwood. Redstarts, woodpeckers, and tree creepers have always lived in these woodlands. But it's only in the last 30 years that they've been joined by firecrests. It's the cock hawfinch that starts the nest to entice a hen into his territory. Although by far the largest finch in Britain, the hawfinch is quiet and elusive. Its nest is hidden high in the trees. The hawfinch's massive beak can crack cherry stones, the hardest of the seeds and nuts that it feeds on. But now it delivers a mixture of insects. Over the centuries, the creatures that live on the forest floor had to adapt to the unusual conditions caused by grazing. As there are few nocturnal small mammals on the open ground, foxes have had to change their diet. Here they hunt squirrels, so they're active by daylight. Since food is in short supply, there are fewer foxes here than on farmland or in cities. Domestic livestock has shared these woodlands with the deer for centuries, but their needs were often in conflict. Deer require some ground cover to hide fawns until they're strong enough to follow their mothers. But as the human population rose, so too did the numbers of domestic animals in the forest, to the detriment of the deer. However, this was to change after 1066. The invading Normans brought fresh ideas to Britain. Deer were a valuable resource for the crown, and the woodlands were managed to increase their numbers. The Normans also introduced a new kind of deer, the fallow deer. Under William the Conqueror, the wasteland called Ytene by the Saxons was placed under forest law, the first such royal forest in England, the New Forest. Under this kind of management, livestock had to be removed for a month during summer, the fence month, to let the fawns grow undisturbed. The trees were also managed by pollarding. Cut too high for deer and livestock to reach, the crown of tender new growth could be harvested for winter fodder. Pollarding encourages trees to live to a great age. Although the practice was banned here in the 17th century, many ancient pollards still survive. The New Forest owes much of its character to these stately trees. Old trees foster a diverse community of animals and plants, especially slow-growing lichens, mosses and liverworts. Inside living trees, the caterpillar of the goat moth must spend up to 8 years gnawing at its low-calorie diet of wood before it turns into one of Britain's biggest moths. The injured tree oozes sweet sap, which entices insects such as hornets. Sugar provides fuel for flight, but hornets must bring flesh in the form of other insects to feed their growing larvae. The New Forest is now one of the few strongholds of these large wasps. Fallen timber from the old trees is left to rot and provides food for other grubs, including those of the stag beetle. The adult males have huge jaws, which they use in battle like antlers. In other woodlands, where fallen logs and stumps are meticulously cleared, these combats are a rare sight. By autumn, the hornet colonies are dying out. A drone mates with a virgin queen on the forest floor. Then, his usefulness over, he too will die. Before the end of autumn, the new queen must find a place to hibernate amongst the ancient trees. For the Norman kings, the forest was a royal larder, supplying venison for state banquets. To manage the forest and its deer, there was an army of officials, regarders to make regular patrols of the area, agisters to police the forest and collect fines, verderers to sit in judgment on poachers and other offenders against forest law. And to harvest the deer, there were professional huntsmen, who, at the command of the king, rounded them up and herded them into nets with deerhounds. Under royal protection, the deer flourished as never before. There were once 8,000 animals in the forest, so in winter, forage was in short supply. In the interests of the deer, another forest law, winter haning, forced the commoners to remove their stock during winter, though for a fee, the rule would be waived. One of the few shrubs left to eat was holly. An evergreen, it's a major source of food throughout the winter. And its berries have always sustained winter visitors from the north, such as redwings and fieldfares. The king's deer were protected by harsh laws. A poacher could be put to death, though in practice he was more likely to be fined. Filling the king's treasury was far more important, since royal forests were an expensive luxury. But they were maintained as much for political reasons as for meat and money. For instance, the king could gain favor with powerful bishops and barons by letting them hunt in his forest. Where the forest flooded in winter, pools provided a temporary home to teal, quarry for the nobleman's falcon, the peregrine. Once released, the peregrine gains height to wait for the ducks to break cover. With the passing centuries, supporting the deer became uneconomical. The forest warden still had considerable powers, but the deer themselves were a nuisance when it came to exploiting the forest in other ways. Wood was the building material used for everything, from walls and fences to furniture and wheels. Craftsmen and tradesmen came from far afield. There was an unlimited crop of wood. Trunks cut off at the base will re-sprout like pollards. The poles can be harvested every 4 or 5 years, and such coppiced trees never die. Coppiced woodlands also fueled the iron forges of pre-industrial England. Burnt slowly in these kilns, wood produces charcoal. In the Middle Ages, woodland management was a lucrative business, but it had to be protected. Unlike pollards, the shoots from coppiced trees were easily reached by both deer and livestock, so coppice woodland had to be fenced. Freed from grazing, the woodland flowers returned. Coppicing opens up the canopy, letting light and warmth reach the forest floor, to the benefit of the flowers. Warmth is also needed in spring to draw adders from their communal hibernation sites. The snakes are hungry when they emerge, but there are plenty of small mammals in coppiced woodland to feed them. Adders are normally creatures of more open ground, but these woodlands are warm enough for them to prosper and breed. After mating, the female spends most of her time basking on the forest floor. The warmer she is, the sooner she can deliver her brood of 10 or so live young. Beyond the ditches and fences of the enclosed woodland, grazing and farming continued. On the poor soils, this often resulted in the spread of heathland. Most of these heaths are man-made. Regular burning and heavy grazing keeps the ground open. It's only these low heaths that resound in spring to the voice of Britain's best songster, the woodlark. They find food on the short turf, but need bigger tussocks to hide their nests. It's all but invisible, even to the creatures whose teeth and hooves helped create the surroundings it needs. Large areas of short-cropped grass break the monotony of the heathland. Fertilized by dung and heavily grazed, grass survives better than heather. At first sight, these forest lawns look like any other pasture. But even here, there are surprises. For this is one of Britain's rarest fungi. It can only grow on the dung of horses feeding on natural pasture. The flowers that survive here only do so because they're distasteful. Marsh gentian and autumn fellwort. After heavy rain, some of the lawns flood, and enriched by plenty of fertilizer, they fill with life. Tadpole shrimps and fairy shrimps hatch from drought-resistant eggs to grow and breed before the pond dries up again. The long history of farming and grazing on these poor soils has created some of the most extensive heaths in Europe. Dartford warblers reach the northernmost part of their range here. Small creatures have to solve the problem of finding each other over such vast expanses. A female emperor moth advertises her presence by spraying an alluring scent into the air from this gland. Carried by the wind, the chemicals are detected several miles away by the male's antennae. She's signaling her willingness to mate, and he receives the message. It takes only a few molecules of this powerful aphrodisiac to excite the male, and he sets off upwind to follow the trail. Other males are drawn by the scent, and it's a race to be first to mate with her. The New Forest is a patchwork of ancient woodlands, bogs and heaths, each with its own rich natural history. It's this mix that makes the New Forest so special. Badgers that dig their sets in woodland often leave them at dusk to forage for dung beetles on the open lawns. In Elizabethan times, wood from the New Forest was in ever greater demand. There was plenty of small timber elsewhere, but large timber was needed for building, to shore up the roofs of cathedrals, or to make ships for the navy. The royal forests were raided for their massive trees. In 1698, the appetite for wood resulted in a new law. allowing part of the woodland to be enclosed for forestry. Inside the enclosures, the ancient trees were felled and replaced with oak plantations. But to avoid a peasant revolt, the same law had to recognize the rights of the local people to use the open forest as common land. The foresters would have to be content with only part of the forest, at least for the time being. Like coppiced woodland, the new plantations were protected from grazing. Insects flourished as never before on the shrubs and flowers that covered the ground. The caterpillar of the silver-washed fritillary feeds on the leaves of wild violets. The adults are drawn to bramble flowers. Skippers, white admirals, longhorn beetles, the abundance of insects turned these plantations into rich collecting grounds for 19th century naturalists. The removal of ancient oaks allowed beech trees to dominate some parts of the forest. In autumn, their foliage turned the woods to gold. It's during autumn that most fungi make their appearance. Now the dark beechwoods are at their most colourful. This is the time of year when the commoners exercise their right of mast. Their pigs are turned loose in the forest to forage on acorns and beech mast. Conveniently, the pigs eat the green acorns, which are poisonous to deer and other livestock. The pigs themselves seem to be immune. The statutory rights of the commoners had, for a while, limited the spread of forestry and preserved the ancient forest. But the timber here was still too valuable simply to ignore. The struggle between the commoners and the foresters reached a critical point in 1851, when the Deer Removal Act was passed. In return for exterminating the deer that were competing for grazing, the Crown planned to enclose even more land. The deer were virtually eliminated. And if the commoners could be forced to relinquish all their rights, the whole forest could be turned into a plantation. So these rights were made less valuable. Now, even in the absence of deer, the rules of the old deer forest, winter haning in the fence month, were strictly enforced. The commoners would have to remove their stock twice a year. But the commoners refused to give in. Today they still run ponies in the forest. Despite their freedom, all these horses are individually owned, and each year they have to be caught during the pony drifts. The ancient system for managing the royal deer forest still survives, at least in part. Agisters supervise the roundup of ponies, whilst the verderers now speak on behalf of the people they once prosecuted. The ponies are branded and tail marked to show that the fees have been paid, allowing the animals to have the run of the forest. Although the past still lingers here, the forest continues to change. Mandarin ducks, recent escapees from wildfowl collections, are now at home on the wooded rivers and ponds. These secluded pools are similar to the river valleys of China and the Far East, the original home of these tree ducks. In recent years, the demand for fast-growing timber led to conifer plantations replacing some of the broad-leaved woodlands. Pine and larch trees, planted in tight rows, may make economic sense, but only a few creatures make use of them. One such creature is the hobby. They hunt over the open heaths, but are happy to nest in these closed ranks of conifers. They've taken over an old crow's nest. These falcons rarely build their own. By contrast, mandarin ducks need the trees of the old forest for their nests. The chicks are hatched high in a hollow tree and have no choice but to take a leap into the unknown. This century, it looked, once again, as though the new forest was destined to become just another plantation, this time of conifers. But public protest put paid to that. Now the Forestry Commission maintains the mosaic of landscapes, heaths, bogs, ponds and woodlands, and the creatures that live in them. The layers of history that have made this mosaic are still close to the surface in these ancient woodlands. The forest has given support in different ways to many generations of people. Can it now bear the burden of ever more visitors seeking spiritual refreshment? Has the new forest survived thousands of years of exploitation simply to be worn out by too many feet? Only time will tell.